Welcome to Mindful Moments, packed with insights but designed to fit into your busy life. We always hear about the Cuban Missile Crisis as like this big win for America, right? Like Kennedy stared down the Soviets and they totally backed down. But is that really the whole story? Like, what if it was way closer to a nuclear war than we think? What if we just got lucky?
Yeah, that's exactly what we are digging into today. We are taking a look at, mainly Serhii Plokhy's book, Nuclear Folly.
Oh, nuclear folly, yeah.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because it looks at all the things that like almost went wrong during the crisis. It's kind of scary, actually.
It is. Plokhy really goes into all the near misses and the mistakes that were made, and he does it in a way that shows how close we came to a full-blown nuclear war. Like, it really could have happened. It makes you realize that the outcome we know wasn't a sure thing at all.
So our goal today is to kind of like, I guess, go through all those close calls, right? All those miscalculations, and see how things could have easily gone in a completely different direction.
Right. We are going to look at the what ifs and uncover those hidden details that really show how fragile things were. And we are going to use your materials to do this. But like I said, we'll mainly be focused on nuclear folly.
Okay, cool. So I think a good place to start is with something a little more recent that kind of shows how easy it is to screw things up when it comes to nuclear weapons. Like the false missile alert that happened in Hawaii back in 2018. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, that was a huge wake-up call. It showed that even with all our technology and safeguards, things can still go terribly wrong.
Right. And it wasn't just like a glitch or something. The book mentions that it took a person actually pushing two buttons to send out that alert.
It's crazy, right? Like a 10-year veteran had to make that mistake. Hawaii had just started testing its sirens again after like 30 years of not doing it. So people were already on edge, and then boom, this false alarm happens.
Let's talk about chaos. Okay, so going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and Plocky's book, what's he trying to get us to see differently by focusing on those near misses and misjudgments?
Well, he really wants us to see that the narrative we often hear about Kennedy being this, heroic figure who outsmarted the Soviets is way too simplistic.
So it wasn't just about Kennedy being tough.
Right. Plokhy argues that a lot of it came down to luck, to miscalculations on both sides, and just how close we came to disaster by accident. He also wants us to consider the Cuban perspective, which hasn't always been included in the story. Thanks to recently declassified material, we can now see that it wasn't just a two-way standoff between the U.S. and the USSR. Cuba played a huge role.
Gotcha. So basically the crisis was a lot messier and less predictable than most people realize.
Exactly. And this idea of unpredictability and danger is something we see even today, decades after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, look at what happened with the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was a huge arms control agreement.
Yeah, right. The U.S. and Russia pulled out of it back in 2019. I remember a lot of people were worried about that.
And for good reason. It basically opened the door for a new arms race, a race to build more and more dangerous weapons. And then, right after the treaty collapsed, we had the Skyfall incident.
Oh, yeah. Wasn't that when that Russian cruise missile exploded?
Right. It was this nuclear-powered cruise missile that Russia was developing. It exploded during a test in the Barents Sea, and it killed several scientists and caused some environmental contamination. It was a pretty big deal.
It definitely sounds like a reminder that these weapons are incredibly dangerous and that accidents can happen.
Absolutely. And what's even more unsettling is that Putin had specifically said that this missile, Skyfall, was meant to target the U.S.
So even though the Cuban Missile Crisis was a long time ago, we are still dealing with the same kinds of nuclear risks today.
That's the point Plocky's trying to make. We can't afford to be complacent. The dangers are still very real.
Absolutely. Now, going back to some of those miscalculations during the crisis, there's one that I found particularly striking. It's about the number of Soviet troops in Cuba.
You mean what Robert McNamara found out in 1992 at that Havana conference?
Exactly. Like, imagine this. The U.S. thought there were about 10,000 Soviet troops in Cuba during the crisis. But later on, a Soviet general who was involved in the planning revealed that there were actually way more.
Like, way, way more. It turned out there were 43,000 Soviet troops there. Can you believe that?
That's more than 4 times the number the U.S. was working with. That's a massive intelligence failure.
Right. And it shows that the U.S. was making decisions based on information that was totally wrong. I mean, imagine trying to plan for a potential invasion or an airstrike when you have no idea how many troops you would actually be facing.
It's a good reminder that even the most powerful countries can make huge mistakes, especially when they are dealing with limited information in a crisis situation.
No kidding. Okay, so to understand how we got to that point where the world was on the brink of nuclear war, we need to rewind a bit and look at the context. Kennedy came into office with a very particular vision for America, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. He was all about projecting American power on the world stage. Like he wanted to create a Pax Americana where the U.S. was the dominant force.
Right. And this was during the Cold War, remember? So the threat of communism was seen as very real and very dangerous, especially in Latin America, which was practically in America's backyard.
Yeah, and Cuba was a bit of a thorn in America's side, wasn't it?
It was. Cuba had been a Spanish colony, and then it was heavily influenced by the U.S. for a long time. But then Castro came along and overthrew Batista.
And Castro wasn't exactly America's best friend.
No, not at all. At first, there was some hope that things might improve with Castro in charge, but that didn't last long. He started executing officials from the old regime, and he nationalized a lot of American-owned businesses.
Which brings us to the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. That was a total disaster, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, it was a major miscalculation on the part of the U.S. The plan was to train and equip a group of Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. But everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
Like the plan relied on this idea that the Cuban people would rise up and support the invasion, but that didn't happen at all.
Nope. And then the air support for the invasion was botched, and they lost crucial supply ships. Plus, they underestimated the strength of Castro's forces. The whole thing was a mess, and it ended up making Kennedy look weak and indecisive.
And how did Khrushchev react to the Bay of Pigs fiasco?
Well, he saw it as a sign that Kennedy was inexperienced and maybe not as tough as he had seemed. And you have to remember that Khrushchev was an old hand at this kind of geopolitical maneuvering. He had been around the block a few times.
So Khrushchev started to think that he could push Kennedy around a bit.
Yeah, kinda. And then there was the whole thing about the missile gap. The Soviets believed, or at least they claimed to believe, that they had more nuclear missiles than the U.S., and they used that to their advantage.
I mean, it sounds crazy, but there's even a story about the KGB trying to help Kennedy win the election in 1960.
Yeah, that's one of the more intriguing parts of this whole story. It seems that Khrushchev instructed the KGB to discreetly help Kennedy win the election, thinking that he would be easier to deal with than Nixon.
So Khrushchev thought he had Kennedy in his pocket, so to speak.
Yeah, he thought that Kennedy owed him a favor, and that's why he pushed so hard for a summit meeting in Vienna in 1961. He wanted to size Kennedy up and see what he was made of.
And how did that summit go?
Well, it was pretty tense. Khrushchev came in acting like the seasoned veteran, trying to intimidate the younger, less experienced Kennedy. They clashed over Berlin, which was another major flashpoint in the Cold War.
And then, of course, we had the Berlin Wall going up just a few months later. That must have been a huge blow to Kennedy.
It was. The Berlin Wall was a symbol of Soviet oppression, and it made the U.S. look powerless to stop it. And there was even a tense standoff between U.S. and Soviet tanks at Checkpoint Charlie. It was a really dangerous situation.
So the Cold War was really heating up at this point. And then the Soviets detonated the Tsar Bomba, the biggest nuclear weapon ever tested.
Yeah, that was a pretty clear message to the world. Khrushchev was flexing his muscles and showing that the Soviet Union was a force to be reckoned with. He did this right in the middle of their big party congress, too, so it was a huge spectacle.
It's amazing how much was going on at this time. And then in December 1961, Castro declared that Cuba was officially a Marxist-Leninist state and asked for military aid from the Soviet Union.
Right, and this put Khrushchev in a tough spot. I mean, he couldn't really refuse to help a fellow communist country, could he? But at the same time, he didn't want to provoke the U.S. too much, so he played it cautiously at first.
So he was trying to figure out his next move. And then there was that whole incident with Anibal Escalante in April 1962. What was that all about?
Escalante was a member of the old Cuban Communist Party, and he didn't like the direction Castro was taking the country. He went to Moscow to complain about Castro and to suggest that the Soviets should support someone else. But Khrushchev didn't want to get involved in Cuban internal politics. He decided to stick with Castro and to present a united front against the U.S.
It seems like Khrushchev was more concerned with the bigger picture, the global struggle against the U.S., than with the details of Cuban politics.
Exactly. And then just a month later, he went on this big, over-the-top trip to Bulgaria. It was like he's trying to create this image of himself as the leader of the communist world, almost like a communist pope or something.
So he was really building up his own power and prestige. And then in May 1962, he made the fateful decision to send nuclear missiles to Cuba. What was he thinking?
Well, the main reason was to deter a U.S. invasion of Cuba. After the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev was convinced that the U.S. was planning another attack, and he wanted to make it too risky for them to try. He also wanted to level the playing field in terms of nuclear weapons. You see, the U.S. had missiles in Turkey and Italy that could reach the Soviet Union.
So Khrushchev felt like he needed to do something dramatic to protect Cuba and to counter the U.S. threat.
Exactly. And he thought that putting missiles in Cuba would force the U.S. to take him seriously.
But wasn't there some opposition to the plan within the Soviet leadership?
Yeah, there was. Anastas Mikoyan, who was a pretty experienced and level-headed guy, was really worried about the secrecy of the operation. He thought it would be impossible to keep the missiles hidden from the U.S. for long, and he was right.
So the whole plan was incredibly risky from the start.
It was. Even some of the Soviet generals involved in the deployment had doubts about whether they could pull it off without being detected. They were right to be worried.
So how did Operation Anadir, the secret mission to get the missiles to Cuba, actually unfold?
Well, it was a huge logistical challenge. They had to transport thousands of troops, tons of equipment, and of course the missiles themselves all across the Atlantic without being detected.
It sounds like something out of a spy movie.
It kind of was. They used all sorts of elaborate deception tactics. For example, they gave the Soviet personnel fake documents identifying them as agricultural specialists.
Agricultural specialists?
Yeah, it was pretty ridiculous. And the conditions on the ships were terrible. They were overcrowded. And the secrecy meant that the crews couldn't even go ashore for breaks.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was. And the morale among the troops was pretty low. A lot of them didn't even know what they were doing or why they were going to Cuba.
So the whole operation was shrouded in secrecy and confusion.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, this kind of secrecy can lead to all sorts of problems.
So while all of this was happening, did the U.S. have any clue what the Soviets were up to?
Well, they started to get suspicious in August and September of 1962 when they noticed a lot more Soviet ships heading to Cuba. And there were reports of Soviet military personnel being spotted on the island.
So the U.S. knew something was up, but they didn't know exactly what.
Right. And this guy, Senator Kenneth Keating, actually went public and said that he thought the Soviets were building missile bases in Cuba.
So he was right all along.
He was. But at the time, a lot of people dismissed him as an alarmist.
So what did Kennedy do?
Well, he was in a tough spot. He didn't want to overreact, but he also couldn't ignore the possibility that the Soviets were putting missiles in Cuba. So he authorized more U-2 spy plane flights over the island.
And those U-2 flights eventually provided the proof that the missiles were there, right?
Yeah, on October 14th, a U-2 pilot named Major Richard Heiser took pictures that clearly showed Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba.
So that was the smoking gun.
It was. And at that point, Kennedy had to decide what to do. He was under a lot of pressure to take military action, but he also knew that doing so could lead to a nuclear war.
It must have been an incredibly difficult decision.
It was. He convened a group of advisors called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, to help him figure out what to do.
So what options did they consider?
Well, they talked about everything from a full-scale invasion of Cuba to a surgical airstrike to take out the missile sites. But in the end, they decided on a naval blockade.
Why a blockade?
They thought it was the least provocative option. It would give Khrushchev a chance to back down without losing face, and it would buy Kennedy some time to figure out his next move.
So the blockade was a way to de-escalate the situation, at least initially.
Exactly. And it also gave Kennedy a chance to try to work out a diplomatic solution with Khrushchev.
So how did Khrushchev react to the blockade?
Well, he was furious. He saw it as an act of aggression, and he threatened to break through the blockade. But he also knew that he couldn't risk a war with the U.S.
So he was in a bind.
He was. And to make matters worse, he had to deal with Castro, who was even more hawkish than he was. Castro actually wanted Khrushchev to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against the U.S.
Wow, that's insane.
It is. But Khrushchev knew that would be suicide. So he tried to find a way out of the crisis without losing face or starting a war.
So how did he do that?
Well, after a lot of back-and-forth negotiations, he agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade the island. He also secretly agreed to remove some Soviet missiles from Turkey.
So it was a compromise, but it was a compromise that saved the world from nuclear war.
That's right. And it's a reminder that even in the most dangerous situations, diplomacy can sometimes prevail.
It's also a reminder of how important it is to have clear communication and to understand the other side's perspective.
Absolutely. And I think this is something that the AI audiobook analysis YouTube channel Mindful Moments does a really good job of highlighting. They often break down complex historical events and explore the different perspectives involved.
That's a good point. Because if there's one thing we can learn from the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's that miscommunication and miscalculation can have devastating consequences.
No kidding. And it makes you wonder what would have happened if those Soviet submarine commanders had actually launched those nuclear torpedoes, or if Khrushchev had listened to Castro and launched a preemptive strike.
It doesn't bear thinking about. So what's the big takeaway from all of this?
Well, I think it's that we should never take peace for granted. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a wake-up call, and it's a reminder that we need to be constantly vigilant about the dangers of nuclear weapons.
I completely agree. And it's not just about governments and world leaders. It's about all of us being aware of the risks and doing what we can to promote peace and understanding.
Right. We all have a role to play in preventing another crisis like this.
Well, that's a sobering but important thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your expertise on this fascinating and frankly terrifying chapter in history.
My pleasure. It was a great discussion.
And to our listeners, if you found this deep dive into nuclear folly as insightful as I did, please do subscribe and share it with others. We'll have a link in the show notes where you can purchase the book and explore further. And most importantly, keep thinking critically about the world around you. The more we understand history, the better equipped we are to avoid repeating of its mistakes.